So, Brittany, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lacey, and hi to everyone. And we appreciate you guys having us here at the CSR Marketplace Live to talk about one of our favorite topics at Accelerist, which is social impact measurement and reporting. We know it's a hot topic for a lot of folks, especially in today's marketplace, as you're vying for funds, vying for support, both internally and externally, for all the good work that you're doing. And we think the best way to actually support that work and to support any increased funding resources for impact is through measurement. Let's prove it. Let's prove that it has an impact both on the community and bottom line so that we can do more of what we all want to be doing. And so it's one of our favorite topics for that reason. We're going to jump in here in a second. I do want to introduce myself. As Lacey said, I am the CEO and founder here at Accelerist. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, of course, at email at bhill@accelerist.com. And if you're not familiar with Accelerist, we are a social impact software platform devoted to supporting profit purpose partnerships in particular. So we work with both corporations, corporate foundations like yourselves, and nonprofit organizations to help you identify from a corporate perspective certain issues to stand for, how to track those issues, what matters to your constituents, how that aligns with your brand, how to maybe identify right fit partnerships. We also have technology to support any consumer fundraising that you might want to do or are doing, workforce engagement, not just giving, of course, it includes that as well, donor analytics, storytelling and marketing, and of course, the topic of today, measurement and reporting. So we're sort of that software resource for all things corporate philanthropy, or the S in ESG. We do have a proven track record and have the privilege of working with many brands on both sides of this aisle that we live in, on the brand side, both on the consumer and the B2B perspective. So with that being said, we know that the impact of CSR is undeniable, right? We know that there's now this direct lineage when it comes to philanthropy or giving or social responsibility or corporate community relations, whatever you want to call it. We are talking about the S in ESG. And we know that now there is this direct correlation to bottom line. And there are a few different areas that this kind of has been proven out in the last few years, right? When it comes to revenue, for example, right? In 2019, pre-pandemic, I feel like we need a 2019 or a pre, before pandemic and after pandemic, a BP and an AP. But pre-pandemic, the General Mills organization corporation, obviously, they actually reported a savings of nearly $5 million when they reduced its carbon footprint by 6,000 metric tons. And so we're now seeing the sustainability area, of course, or the E in ESG, really, is probably the most tracked, the most sophisticated when it comes to metrics and measurement. And now that's being directly tied back to bottom line, and therefore this very lovely cycle of a continued infusion of funds to support environmental sustainability efforts. We've also seen metrics being proven to support brand reputation, right? 92% almost of consumers say they would not only buy from a company that of course supports a good cause, but also one with an excellent CSR program. So it's not just that you're giving or donating a percentage of sales or engaging your workforce, but the entire program holistically is what consumers in particular are paying attention to. It's not just a transactional commitment. Even more so, 84% say that they would give companies with an excellent CSR program the benefit of the doubt, maybe in an event of a crisis or a PR issue. So we know that it has direct correlation to brand reputation, which ultimately lifts both consumers and employees, because gosh, we know how important it is when it comes to recruitment and retention right now, and our brand reputation's role in those activities is critical. We also know it's profitable, right? We've connected the dots now in terms of high purpose brands have been proven to double their market value more than 4 times faster than low purpose brands. And so we can see, okay, those that have a purpose, we can measure that. we can also lift and float all boats, especially when it comes to profitability. So I think we're all here. We're all on this train. We're all on the purpose train, right? We call you guys and us purpose people. And we know that it works. We know that it is and should be directly connected to who we are as a brand, what we stand for, what we do, who we support, and how we do that. But because of that, now that we all know that these correlations are there, now we have all been asked, I'm sure you have, I don't know if you can input in the chat box, if you've been asked by leadership, shareholders, anyone, to prove it, right? To report on what you're doing. And the extent of that has kind of gone from one end of just do those works for the benefit of the greater good. And we don't maybe need to know about it. Maybe we need to know how much we donated or kind of big numbers, right? And now it's swung all the way back to the other side where we've heard, especially from either some of members here, even with the CECP and other trade organizations, have said that their shareholders have asked them for nearly 125 plus metrics to report on, especially those that are public brands, on a quarterly basis. And that's also astounding. There can't be, the question is, there can't be 125 metrics that actually matter in this landscape. So what should we be measuring? How do we do this? And what do we focus on? What can we start with? Depending on what kind of brand and company we are. And so we actually did a survey and a study with about 600 different corporate social responsibility executives at the end of 2021 to ask them what their state of the union was. How are we reporting as an industry? What kinds of measurement metrics what are we measuring? How are we reporting those metrics? How are we telling a story around those metrics? So on and so forth. So here are some of the results from that study. We first had to kind of get a sense of what are we working with now? And then where do we want to go? Where are the pain points and challenges so that we can improve upon this and make it an attainable approach when it comes to reporting? So 80% of those respondents said they plan to invest more in resources to actually collect more metrics and report in a more frequent way. Also, 80% said that they their companies place a lot of importance on this reporting now. So that's great. We know that internally, there's now at least leadership support behind measurement. We think, there's the old adage, right? If we can't measure it, it doesn't matter. And so we can't see it, we can't improve upon it. So we know this is here, we know we need to do something, but where do we start? And so thank you guys in the chat. You guys have heard that your audiences, the expectations, the demands are there. And there's a lot of folks that are doing this really well. And I want to talk about some of those a little bit later. And hopefully you guys can share some stories that you have too. But there are so many metrics out there, right? Especially if you look at measurement and reporting from a holistic perspective when it comes to environmental social governance, or ESG, the entire spectrum, not just the S, which is what we'll talk about mostly today. But if you look at all of those metrics across ESG, there's a lot here. So if you look at the E, right, we have things like sustainable products, renewable energy percentages. These are very technical, sustainability, environmental technical metrics that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Scope 1 and 2, and climate commitments, and resource uses and efficiencies. Then we have governance, right? If we skip over the S for a second, things like board independence, board diversity, oversight, legal fines, violations, SEC filings, cash flow, financial management. That's a very, again, specific technical approach to measurement. And then we get to the S, which I like to say is kind of the squishier of the letters. It's more of the wild, wild west. The E has a lot of the technical approach. So in some ways, it's a much more parametered way. And those infrastructures have been in place longer than the S metrics have been. But when we do kind of break it down, and we like to break it down into 3 different categories, when we look at social, or the S metrics, and we look at workers, and that's of course workforce, things like fair and living wage. It's not just philanthropy, right? Or not just employee engagement or volunteerism. It's worker health and safety, benefits, work-life balance, all of this should fall under the S. Of course, DEI, workplace training. And then we have our customers. Again, customer engagement is great, but as well in terms of your social responsibility, but there's also things like customer privacy and transparent communication and respect and positivity that are required of companies. And then we also have communities. So not only what you're giving to that community, the last note here, but also job creation. A lot of companies forget that the way that they are supporting communities isn't just felt in a check that they're writing at the end of the year. Or through quarterly fundraisers, right? It's actually through job creation, human rights, supply chain development, community development. So all of that can be measured, should be measured, and should roll up into that S. And so, but that's a lot. It's a lot of metrics to handle. And it doesn't necessarily, it's not a one size fits all. A lot of companies play more, obviously, in sustainability and less in social justice or the S, and vice versa. And so when we kind of asked our executives, again, the 600 plus executives throughout the US, at the end of last year, what they were most commonly measuring, this is what they dove into here. You can see the most common thing measured and reported on is their overall spend on impact. So how much are they spending? And that includes donations, time savings, anything that's an expense line item. But then we look at things like workforce engagement was number 2. Out of order a little bit here is your ESG goals and targets, and that includes SDG or Sustainable Development Goal alignment and targets that you have committed to if you do subscribe to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Right behind that is consumer engagement and loyalty, brand reputation, and then of course customer loyalty. Maybe you're a B2B company and you still have customers, not necessarily consumers, so you want to measure that as well as employee loyalty. And so we're again going through the workplace, the customer base, and the community base is really where a lot of those corporate social responsibility, and that's very specific. Again, we're going to hone in on the S here. That's our area of expertise. And I think the only area that we can cover within an hour when it comes to measurement and reporting. And so those are kind of what folks are measuring most now. I don't know if you can see a show of hands in the chat box of if you agree with this, if you're measuring this as well, if you're not measuring some, let us know if you're kind of tracking there. When it comes to, though, the act of measurement, right, market challenges, we see that 71% of those same participants in that survey felt confident that they have a good reporting system in place, but they don't have enough manpower. Nearly half of them felt that way. They don't have the right tools. Maybe they don't even have an official CSR team. So they're trying to pull, maybe you're a marketing manager and you're charged with also reporting on that, plus your HR counterpart is, on a committee with you to handle social responsibility or social impact. And then a third felt that they still didn't have an internal champion to say that this matters, that, hey, we're not just doing this for the good of the community. We do need to measure it so we can even do more in the community, and that this is a priority that we need to invest in, not just, do good work. We have to invest to do more kind of conversation. So that hasn't yet seemingly hit about a third of companies out there. Another, some of the other anecdotal or more qualitative feedback that we heard was that there's no 360-degree view of CSR measurement, right? So maybe we're measuring, our marketing team is measuring brand reputation, but another is measuring societal impact, and we're working with our nonprofit partners to do that. Or maybe, our finance team or our governance team, our investor relations team is measuring bottom line impact, but we never hear about it over here at the foundation, right? Of what the philanthropy that we're actually dispelling and communicating within the foundation isn't actually being tied back to or measured as part of brand reputation. And we're not getting kind of credit for that. Not that we need credit, but we're not connecting the dots. There's no 360 view. There's also not one source. Again, collaborative reporting. ESG is happening at the IR, the investor relations level. And really, a lot of the S in particular is being lost because those gatekeepers are not involved in reporting conversations. So there's not one source. And then again, there are all these KPIs. And we wanted to know, well, what does impact? We wanted to help you guys answer that question. This is what we're measuring now, but what should we be measuring moving forward that has the greatest impact to business? Now, of course, mission impact, community impact should be front and center with what we're doing. But in order to greenlight funds, in order to prioritize resources, and again, in order to leverage that to do more, we've got to be able to focus our energy and know what metrics matter the most. So we went again to the source and took a look at the industry in terms of what was happening, what was being reported when it comes to ESG metrics and commitments and activity and impact. And we actually partnered with Just Capital and the Russell 1000. If you're not familiar, the Russell 1000 is an index just like the NASDAQ or the S&P 500 of 1,000 purpose-driven companies that report on a comprehensive data set of environmental social governance metrics according to the Just Capital framework. If you want any more information on all of that, I'm happy to dive into details in the Q&A. But essentially, it breaks down into these 5 different categories: environmental metrics, worker or workplace metrics, customer metrics, community metrics, and governance metrics. So some of the same similarities and concepts we all know and love, but just bracketed out a little bit differently. And we wanted to know which of these metrics, of those maybe 120 plus, 120 plus metrics, which of them actually have the greatest correlation to and on profitability, share price, and revenue growth. Because those are 3 bottom line metrics that your shareholders, that your leadership, that they will care about so that they will greenlight funds and resources and support and cheerlead and help you do more in the community if you can prove that correlation. So let's focus on what matters most. Let's figure out what that is. So we did a longitudinal study and can tell you more about that. The actual full study is being released in the next few days. You're kind of seeing this information hot off the press. But we took a look at, when it comes to something like share price, companies saw an average of 218% increase in share price. These are, again, public companies. So even if you're not a public company, you can still, I think, relate if their share price is going up and increasing this amount, this much. Obviously, they're doing something right. And it's not just a one-time blip, although you can see a huge spike in 2021. There's still some growth over a 5-year span. But there's a little blip in 2021, obviously due to the pandemic and other infusion of capital in a lot of ways, especially with the stock market. But you can see here top correlated CSR traits. First and foremost is that they have at least one charitable recipient. Now, this isn't mind-blowing here, but really the meat of this is that the company discloses not just the name of that participant, but what they are contributing to. It's distinct impact reporting of we gave $1 million and here's what those use of funds did in the community. So that's the sort of underlying factor there. The other is board and gender diversity, which I know is an ongoing conversation. We've seen a lot of stats outside of this webinar that speak to, the more diverse your board and obviously your executive team is, the more profitable and successful that company has, can be. The other things are their diversity and opportunity policy, and then also local sourcing. So those are some interesting, I think, correlated CSR traits when it comes to share price. But we did look at this across the last 5 years since 2018 when the data was available. The other thing is when we look at profit margin. So companies saw an average of 82% increase in their profit margin for these following correlated traits. Paid time off for volunteering. So companies that are sponsoring employee volunteer programs, they give paid time off to allow their workforces to give back in the community, whether it's virtual or in person. They also have match employee giving. So they are matching, whether it's 1-to-1, 2-to-1, donors for dollars, dollars for doers, whatever program you subscribe to. There's some sort of incentive and match that the employer's in it with their workforce. Accountability to stakeholders, that goes into governance conversations. And then again, here with transparent communication. This is not just from a philanthropic perspective, but in advertising, in labeling with their customers. So we're building trust. If we're building trust with consumers or customers from a labeling and branding perspective, why wouldn't we continue that same trajectory and transparency throughout our impact and our community relations work, or our CSR ESG work, right? So you can see our workforce and customer force largely contributed to profit margin increases. So a little bit different than share price. So health of company, a little bit different from profitability, which I find fascinating. And then lastly, some additional traits here, some of the same suspects. But again, companies saw an average of 128% increase in revenue that again gave to recipients and were very disclosed use of funds from that perspective, diversity and equity and inclusion, and then specifically human rights reporting. So an assessment of whether the company discloses any of those negative findings around human rights violations or other things. So again, going back to the importance of which traits, which metrics matter the most, and how can we pull kind of the 120 down to maybe 10 or 20. This is what we found in our research. And across that ESG spectrum, you can see in the larger study that the 10 that matter the most or that correlate the most to those three bottom line metrics at least were environmental, of course, specifically in sustainable products and services. So building sustainable companies, sustainable offerings, not necessarily just supply chain, but actually starting from a place of, is the product sustainable? Is the service sustainable? And then secondly, under the social area, we have our charitable recipients, our transparent communication, workforce engagement, and workforce volunteerism. And then under governance, our DEI policies, accountabilities, human rights reporting, local sourcing, and then board and gender diversity. So once we looked at that, we also dove into this a little bit. I'm not going to go into the whole study or the outcomes here, but this certainly spans and has some key players when it comes to industries, when it comes to growth, when it comes to even certain companies. And so we wanted to point out some of those industries that we saw were trending when it came to these correlated metrics. So some of the top industries when it comes to, again, these metrics were pharmaceuticals and biotech. You can see the growth. Obviously, this has been a huge growth industry over the last few years for obvious reasons. Always is a big industry and a big donor and social citizen. But specifically around other areas that you might not necessarily anticipate from a pharmaceutical company like AstraZeneca. Their ambition was to go zero carbon, planning to invest $1 billion to achieve zero carbon emissions by 2025, and to be carbon negative by 2030. So huge goals here, huge investments, and obviously metrics along the way to support not just this pledge, but we know now that pledge directly correlates to increased profitability, share price, and revenue. Amgen is another great example on the social side. $13 million in grants to date. The Amgen Foundation, I don't know if you're on the line, but kudos to you. Through their lab exchange, actually, they've engaged over 12 million users last year, and 80% of them were in low or lower middle income countries. So a lot of work, great work being done as usual from Amgen in the social area of ESG, and Biogen on the governance side is an example. 70% of their employees interacted with DEI workshops. So again, going back to the only reason we have these numbers is because they're actually measuring these metrics. So 70% they're saying of their employees interacted with DEI workshops and training modules that they supported their workforce with. They had 2,600 e-learning participants. and ongoing follow-up session participants as part of their governance due diligence and diversity board and gender diversity conversations. So some interesting examples of not only the commitments that companies have made, but how they're measuring and what they're measuring within each of these areas. Software is another great industry example to point to. Of course, software market continues to increase with about a 6% growth rate, anticipated year over year until and through probably 2026. Razor is a software company that's also trying to transition into 100% recyclable products by 2030. Microsoft is always a big social contributor, great corporate citizen. This is just one of the examples where they've supported 104 elementary schools, 9 universities. This is more of an, volume metric. I know Microsoft probably does have this, but we all, I think, are anticipating what's the outcome of that. So we've served 400,000 people on 5 continents, and they've been linked to the internet. Now what? Let's see what happens because of that. What's the outcome of that? And so I think from a social perspective, we all have work to do on that front. Aspen Tech board remains committed to maintaining a balanced and effective board, as they say, and it's actually composed with an independent female chair, 6 new directors. So they've done a huge board overhaul since 2019, and a lot of key appointees there. And lastly, another industry is, with again, huge growth rates, computer services. So one example on the environment side, Manage Engine decided to build a working farm for employees in New Braunfels, Texas, instead of building an office in the city of Austin. And so now they're not having to, they knew that that's where the majority of their employees were living and wanted to work. So they don't have to commute into Austin. They, are reducing emissions from that perspective by choosing to locate their office in that area. Cloudflare provided free security services to journalists and humanitarian organizations and have donated $3 million in services, helping countless civil society organizations across the world. And then again, more supplier diversity programs. So if you are a B2B company, we see a lot, and we have the privilege of working with a few that are also looking at their supplier and their vendor programs. We've even heard, I don't know if you have experienced this, that as a vendor on the other side, you're also asked, what is your CSR impact? What is your commitment? Because they're making vendor decisions, supplier decisions based on your commitments. And if you can't measure it, you can't explain it, and therefore you don't win the business. So again, correlating and drawing that direct line back to bottom line is the name of the game moving forward. It's not, commercial. I think a lot of us that come into our purpose-driven work as altruistic, we still should be, but we have to know it's still business. It should be business. Purpose is big business. And so it's not that you're negating the good work that you're doing, it's that you're now able to correlate it to the health of the business so that you can do more good work. I think that's the lens that we have to look at. And I know I'm probably repeating myself, but I'm going to keep underscoring that point as much as possible. So when it comes to the framework, those are some of the metrics that we're seeing being tracked and measured. A lot of folks say, okay, well, maybe I'm measuring a lot of that. Maybe I could do a little bit more, but there are all these reporting frameworks. How do I pull it into a digestible report or tell a story around that for the sake of brand and marketing? But there's all these frameworks out there. Where do we go from here? And so there is, if you're not familiar, the current ESG ecosystem, it's from reporting standards to frameworks to there's 100+ organizations that have lists and rankings and ratings and scorecards and top companies and most sustainable. And a lot of them are listed here. They all do a little bit of different things. And some are more sustainability focused, some are more social focused, and some of course are more financial or governance focused. And so we sort of pulled this in there for you to show you the evolution of where this has come and where it's going. The important part is here to really pick a framework that works for you. So there's no right or wrong. This is a comparison of some of the more popular reporting frameworks, from ISO to GRI, if you're familiar, which is the Global Reporting Institute or Initiative, also SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, CDP, UN Global Compacts, and the B Impact Assessment. So the primary purpose of each one of these, again, is a little bit different. The audience for reporting, a little bit different. Some all-inclusive, some very specific. Some also work well with others, right? And so depending on who you are and what your role is in the organization, whether you're the head of ESG, whether you're the head of finance, and executive director of your corporate foundation, a legal officer, whatever your role is, and then whoever you are reporting to or ultimately want to report out to, I think you probably, could assess based on this, maybe hopefully this helpful chart, which framework might be best case for you. If you think, you know what, I'm kind of a good span of all, and I want to report out to all or the majority of these folks, I would recommend picking the GRI. It's the most flexible framework. It encompasses the most metrics and CSR factors across the ESG spectrum, and it works well with others in case your sustainability counterpart is reporting already in SASB. You can fold those into that framework. So just a little bit of, I know these are a lot of acronyms, and if you're not familiar with them, I'm sure they could become overwhelming. Maybe you are familiar with them and you've already picked one and would love to know which framework you're using, just to get a fun, survey to see what the majority out there is using. So how do we go beyond this? If we're measuring the S, do we rely on those first kind of 5 or 7 that most CSR executives told us they were already measuring? What do we pair that with? Do we want to lean into some of the reports that we found correlate the most, the metrics that correlate the most with bottom line metrics? Where do we go? And so we kind of have taken a hybrid approach of learning what folks are doing, what correlates greatest, and then some of the other popular frameworks out there that kind of gives us our top 23 list here. Now, this is just a recommendation if you're not knowing where to start, if you want to kind of take even an assessment of your own to see which of these you're measuring or could be measuring. Or maybe this would be helpful as you take this to leadership to say, hey, this is what folks are doing when it comes to measurement, and we need to put something in place, some type of reporting, some type of measurement to capture these metrics so that we can prove impact. This is what that looks like for us at Accelerist, and it's across a couple different categories. First and foremost is the company's social spend. Again, this is measurement of just the S in ESG. So company social spend, things like how much are we giving cash, both from the company, its employees, and your consumers or customers. Non-cash, so if you do a lot of GIK or gifts in kind, if you give a lot of products or donate services, that would be non-cash. And then your, what we call kind of good beyond giving. This would be your employee engagement. So still within the social spend area, but maybe your giving participation rate. How many of your employees are also giving through workplace giving? How many that you're facilitating, right? How many of them are volunteering? And how many hours did they volunteer? And then what kinds of volunteering did they do? Was it skills-based? Was it in person? Was it digital? What kinds of volunteering did that look like? Based on that, and the reason why we focus on that is a lot of that has specific value. The hour of that employee, depending on if it was a skills-based volunteering hour or packing a bag of food, actually holds a different value in general against your return on investment, overall. And you can place tangible value on that. We also look at business value. So things like constituent engagement, engagement from ambassadors or executives, influencers, brand reputation. So if you are working with nonprofit partners, typically they are also activating their constituents around your support of them, right? They might be communicating to them, recognizing you as a donor, maybe through paid, owned, earned, or shared media and marketing channels, and then vice versa, right? Are you communicating how you are impacting communities, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through workforce engagement, or so on, sustainability? And what does that look like? What are those impressions? How many people engage? So we've got to engage our marketing teams or have another channel to do that, to measure those marketing metrics for you so that you can prove the impact on brand reputation. Consumer awareness, employee awareness. Are people even noticing that we are supporting the community? How many people are? How do they feel about it? That goes into sentiment, both on the employee and the customer side. So, a lot of these are very specific, but you can issue very simple surveys now through economical ways to identify if customers and workforce are aware of your good work, are engaged with your good work, and how do they feel about it? Maybe even you would, throw in a question of, would you be more likely to work at our company if you knew about this work, example A? Or are you more loyal to our company because of that? So all of those metrics can be converted into and translated into value. If we have a heightened employee loyalty program, 40% more of our 10% more of our employees are loyal to us now than they were 6 months ago, based on our impact work and our community work. That's a potential reduction in attrition that we could have, or turnover that we've saved, right? And so we can quantify that all against bottom line. Mission impact, of course. The next category here is social value. And these are quantitative metrics that your nonprofit organizations that you support should be able to communicate to you. What is the number of, let's say, mission served audience that was touched, lives saved, people fed, acres clean, dollars invested, whatever that mission impact is? What's the volume of that? And then what's the advancement? We want to make sure that we're making progress. So ask them, over the last 12 months, what positive change have we made? Whether that's together or collectively, the organization. And then the scope, is that local, regional, national, global? And then, of course, if you do subscribe to SDG goals, targets, and indicators, we want to quantitatively identify what that looks like, and of course, report on any traction made against those goals. So those are some of the top 23 metrics. I know it sounds like a lot, but if you can start with 5 or 10 of them, if you're already doing 5 or 10 of them, add 5 more, to really look at that comprehensive picture within the S of constituents, meaning consumers or customers, employees, company, what you're giving and what you're doing, and then brand, and then of course, mission. So each of those areas, and because we know that it's hard to manage that, it's hard to measure and have all of those metrics and measurement capabilities in one place. That is what we do at Accelerist. So we do have an ROI, what we call a measurement and reporting. So we're measuring corporate social responsibility, the S in ESG, and helping you to bring that into an overall impact reporting tool. So you can manage and measure all of your partnerships. You can track that from a media perspective. You can manage and survey customers, workforce, and then pull that into pre-baked frameworks from GRI, from MSCI, from SASB, and others in a simple drag and drop Canvas style type of impact reporting that makes this entire process a lot easier, faster, and more efficient. So I hope that was, I know it was a lot of information, but I hope helpful in not only what a lot of your peers and colleagues are measuring currently, what some of their challenges are. I hope that resonated with you. You might have felt the same way. And then where it's going, what are some of those metrics that matter the most? And how can we use frameworks that already exist to make more sense out of this big conversation when it comes to measurement, because it does matter. So with that, I want to open up questions.
Thanks, Brittany. So we do have one question in the box, and before we get to that for right now, I do just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you have any issues with the Q&A feature, chat them to the hosts and panelists so we can make sure to get those answered. But to start off, one of the questions that is in here is that around the TCFD framework, and how would you compare that to some of the other frameworks that are out there?
I am not familiar with TCFD. Do you mind expanding on that one?
So I know it's one of the ESG frameworks that is out there, and I think what they're really, it's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and so I think what they're just really looking for is, back to your point around, like, how do you know which of these frameworks to choose, or where do you start with all of them?
Yeah, well, it sounds like, just the name alone, it sounds like it's very focused on sustainability measurement and the financial implications of sustainability and climate impacts. And again, if you are a sustainability manager, then that might be very relevant to you. A lot of these frameworks, unfortunately, lack comprehensive views across the entire ESG spectrum. So you might need to use that framework, if that's what your company is subscribing to, alongside another maybe more socially driven framework to have that comprehensive view. So that, unfortunately, we can't get it all together.
That's the dream. One day.
One day it will happen.
Yes. Another question is around the 23 metrics that you shared. Can you give some examples of quantifying around mission advancement?
Yeah. So a great example, we work with a lot of children's hospitals on the nonprofit side of our business, and they would maybe describe mission advancement as treating 10% more children through their emergency room this year than last year, or a medical research institution has invested 5%, 20%, whatever it is, more dollars this year than last year because of their support from maybe that corporate donor. So it's sort of, are we moving the needle? Or I think there's a lot of skepticism, unfortunately, when it comes to the nonprofit sector and the philanthropy sector of, are we actually giving to organizations that are fiscally responsible and impacting their mission, or are we just sort of in this hamster wheel? Are we making progress? And so I think that's a huge metric that we have to look at. Is, I think somebody put it in chat earlier, not just the outputs, not only that we fed 1 million kids, but how did that actually advance the mission? Maybe it's not just 10% more, but maybe it's X more lives were saved, or whatever that looks like. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question is, as we think, one of the metrics that came up that to report on is around, volunteerism and the work that employees are doing. Have you seen any good examples of some of that comes from, getting the employees to actually report that information? Have you seen any good examples with companies that have had success with getting the data from employees about their volunteer service and how they're tracking that information well?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies that have good employee measurement, it's usually because the volunteerism programs or the volunteer programs were initiated by the company as a company-wide or an opportunity that they've provided for their employees. And so the measurement of that, or the check-in, or there are a lot of platforms out there, from Benevity to Your Cause to a lot of others, our own, that you can actually use digital resources to kind of manage the volunteer experience so that you have the metrics built in. if that makes sense. So that's where I've seen the most traction. I haven't heard a lot of success when it comes to just, I guess you could survey your workforce, on a quarterly basis, maybe, or so that it's top of mind. If you wait until an annual survey, they're going to forget what they did 9 months ago, as a volunteer.
Yeah.
I would. And
Yep.
so, thinking about the frequency of surveying, if you're asking them about maybe their volunteer work outside of employer-led initiatives, but I think it's probably best to focus on employer-led initiatives and using digital tools to create that environment so that it's easier to measure on the front end.
Mhm. Thank you.
Mhm.
One final question for you. What are you most excited about or most looking forward to when it comes to measurement and reporting? Like, what's on the horizon that is looking good or exciting as we think about really being able to share the value of the work that we're doing in social impact?
I just think we've finally, I have this vision that we're now all on the train. I feel like we were all kind of waiting in the wings, or we're all standing at the bus stop, waiting for the subway car to come on. And some of us hopped on and then some of us hopped back off. And it's been like that for the last couple of years. And I feel like we're all now on it. And I think the exciting part is there's more and more measurement, there's more and more reporting, and I think you'll only see that increase. But now it's about focusing. And so that's what I'm excited about, is let's focus on what really matters, and so that we can be more impactful. And really, I mean, really exciting part of measurement is being able to make more strategic decisions outside of what you learn, and from the outcomes of what you learn. So if we can say, okay, here's what we're measuring and here's the impact that we're making, then what? That's the big light bulb and $1 million whatever answer is okay, now we can do this over here because we know this more information. Knowledge obviously is power, and when it comes to purpose, can go a long way.
Awesome. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for sharing all of this fantastic information with us. I know measurement and reporting is one of those topics that is top of mind right now for CSR professionals, and there was a lot of great detail and information you shared in your presentation. So we're grateful for you joining us for a CSR Marketplace live session. And for all of our attendees, we did just share a link to a survey. Your feedback is very valuable to us. Please let us know how we did. It will only take a minute or two of your time, and it does help us to improve our programming and know what's important to you as you want to learn and hear about a variety of topics related to corporate social impact. So, Brittany, thank you again for joining us. To all of our attendees, we hope you enjoyed today's session, and look out for the recording, which will be coming out shortly. Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone.